This is now the third class that I'm giving in this series that looks at the meaning of Tisha B'Av through the thought of three leading 20th century Jewish thinkers. We talked about Eliezer Berkovitz a week and a half or so ago. Berkovitz was very focused on the national loss and how the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash meant that the Jewish people no longer or had to take a step out of shaping history and influencing history. And that was the great loss of Tisha B'Av. And of course, for Berkovitz, the great promise of Israel is that it's an opportunity to step back into that historic realm and shape history and be a leading force in the world of nations. And then 2 days ago, we saw that for Rebbe Soloveitchik, Tisha B'Av is very much about that. For Rebbe Soloveitchik in general, moments of crisis and distress are a natural part of life. And rather than run away from them, as he says modern man wants to do because we have a hard time accepting that there are things we can't control, instead we have to learn to accept them and use those moments to motivate us towards introspection and towards greater connection to God, as well as with our community. So for Rebbe Soloveitchik, Tisha B'Av is a chance to delve into this area of human existence of suffering, of crisis, of tragedy that we tend to avoid, but in fact he thinks is very important for our development. So now in the next 40 or 45 minutes or so, we'll talk about the thought of the Lubavitcher Rebbe and how the Lubavitcher Rebbe thought about Tisha B'Av, thought about exile, maybe even a little bit thought about the redemption. We'll see what we get to. The Lubavitcher Rebbe is, of course, famous for really it was started really already by his father-in-law, but he brought it to a whole new level of sending out shlichim, of Hasidim, to different corners of the country and in the world in order to motivate people towards a greater level of Jewish observance. He was born in 1902. He became Rebbe in 1951. And he passed away in 1994. His lifespan is, I think, all of that. The thinkers we've looked at were blessed with an incredible lifespan where they lived almost the entire 20th century. And actually, another similarity between Berkovitz, Rebbe Soloveitchik, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe is they all spent time in the 30s in Berlin. And for all of them, that was very much a formative experience. Berlin was, and they're not alone in that regard. There are other great 20th century Jewish thinkers, Heschel, others that we can think of who were also in Berlin at that time. It was a real, very much a vibrant place for intellectual Jewish life. Okay, so let's dive into some sources here. The Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who we'll use for the title the Lubavitcher Rebbe in this year, becomes the Rebbe of Lubavitch, of the Lubavitch Hasidim, after his father-in-law passes away. His father-in-law passed away, I believe, in 1950, and he, in the spring of 1951, he's achieved widespread acceptance amongst the Hasidim, and he gives an interview. And he was asked about whether or not the fact that the Jewish people were so fragmented to different parts of the globe was a danger or a negative in some way. And he responded, it is a mistake if we conceive of the worldwide dispersion of the Jewish people in exile as a catastrophe. As a matter of fact, this very lack of concentration of the remnants of our nation was a source of our salvation throughout the centuries of persecution and persecution. Hitler was the greatest threat to our national survival. He was the largest concentration of the masses of Eastern and Central European Jewry had come into his evil grasp. On the other hand, however, the concentration of large groups of people into one country has been the means of creating the spiritual centers from which the rest of the Jewish colonies could draw their inspiration, leadership, and material replenishment. Now that the great centers of Eastern Europe have been destroyed by fascism and communism, America has become the focus and fountainhead of Jewish survival. Providence has prepared a new home for the Torah and Yiddishkeit in this country. So there are a couple of remarkable things, I think, in the Lubavitcher Rebbe's answer here to this question. One is that he says immediately that thinking of exile and dispersion as a catastrophe is a mistake. And if we think about the way in which traditionally Tisha B'Av and exile is understood, it is understood as a catastrophe, right? It's understood as a catastrophe. It's understood as occurring because of very directly as a punishment for our sins, and that so this is definitely a shift from at least the simple way of reading some of the traditional sources. Not there are sources that suggest benefits of being in exile, but definitely the majority of sources and the most natural way of reading them would suggest that it is a catastrophe. On the other hand, he admits that, or says that, having a concentration of the Jewish people somewhere does benefit the Jewish people elsewhere, right? Just if you think about how Chabad has set up their system, Crown Heights sort of acts as the center for the leadership and the spiritual life of their Hasidim wherever they are to be found. So there is, and that the Lubavitcher Rebbe thinks that after the destruction of the Jewish communities of Europe, that center has clearly moved to America. And that didn't happen by accident. America, he thinks, he believes is a blessed country, and that God chose America for this purpose and put the Jewish people here in a country also. The Jewish people are blessed to have been placed in a country that provided them and protected their rights and recognized God. And the Lubavitcher area, it's a topic for a different time, but he has a number of talks where he talks about the unique character of America and sort of the greatness of America. Now, just so we can contrast this with what else was going on in his milieu in the Hasidic world of the post-Holocaust Hasidic world, I want to take a quick, a short divergence, I guess, into the world of Satmar. I think, can everyone hear me okay? I didn't mute people. I'm not sure if there's background noise. Are people getting background noise?
I can hear.
Okay.
Hear.
So we'll just leave it as is. This way also, if people have questions, you can just interrupt me.
There's a lot of background noise.
Oh, there is. Okay, so let me go back to my normal routine. I'm going to mute everyone now, and I'll pause periodically so people can ask questions, and also at the end, I'll unmute everyone, and we can discuss the sources if people hold their questions to the end. Okay, so I think everyone is muted for now, and I'll unmute people in a little bit. So we saw that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, one, says exile is not a catastrophe, and two, that America has this sort of unique role in the world that God gave it, and that in that way God blessed America and the Jewish people by creating this safe haven for the Jewish people in the U.S. So elsewhere in the Hasidic world at the time, is Rav Yoel, the Rebbe Yoel, the Satmar Rebbe. Also, the Satmar Rebbe, Satmar is in Hungary. It's very close to Munkach. I know a lot of people in Cleveland, their families can come from that area of the Carpathian Mountains. Satmar was not a large Hasidic group before the war. After the war, when the Satmar Rebbe came to America, first he was in Israel for a short period of time, and then he came to America. He was in Williams and came to first the Lower East Side and then Williamsburg. A lot of the Hungarian Hasidim, whose Hasidic groups had sort of broken apart during the war because their Rebbes hadn't survived, or because their Rebbes were in Israel and they were here, they were looking for leadership and they were looking for community. So the Satmar Rebbe really rebuilt his Hasidic world and his Hasidic community off not just the remnants, not just the survivors from Satmar, but from that broader world of that broader Hungarian Hasidic world. And the Satmar Rebbe was, of course, a fierce opponent of Zionism. As we'll see here, he thinks that the Holocaust was a punishment for Zionism. So let's just take a look at what he has to say, and so we can sort of contrast that with what we saw from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So he says, apart from the severe sin of violating the oath, in the Gemara, the Jewish people take 3 oaths, and one of them is about not ascending to the land of Israel by force. The Zionists also sullied the Jewish people with the defilement of heresy and denial of Hashem. So it is not a surprise that Hashem's powerful anger was aroused, as the Torah warns in Parshat Nitzavim. During the Holocaust, some very pious Jews were killed through the sins of those who sinned and caused others to sin, and the anger of Hashem was similarly terrifying. Similarly, Hashem allowed the Zionists to survive and grow in order to test the Jewish people. Unfortunately, however, the vast majority of Jews have not withstood this difficult trial. We have to repent to Hashem and flee from the Zionists and their supporters faster than one flees from a killer lion that is pursuing him. Whenever it is possible to save even one Jewish soul from falling into their group is a very precious and priceless opportunity. So obviously, there's a big polemic here about Zionism, but basically, this becomes the Satmar Rebbe articulates sort of a passive approach to the Jewish people's role in history. The Jewish people have, according to the way the Satmar Rebbe reads the Gemara, their role is not to try to ascend Israel, not to try to return to the land of Israel, certainly not by force. Instead, it's to do mitzvot in exile, and he created this very protected and cloistered community, erected very strict bounds between his community and the outside world, and that's because he believed the Jewish people were in sort of a life or death situation. You flee to wherever it is you can escape. There's no idea here that America is a unique country and uniquely blessed and anything like that in the way in which the Lubavitcher Rebbe will develop his ideas about America. Instead, wherever any country, that any non-Jewish nation that provides a safe haven, it's a good place to be. Ultimately, though, our plight as Jews, the Satmar Rebbe believed, is that we're going to be persecuted and we may have to flee from place to place. Definitely a different type of approach. And exile for the Satmar Rebbe is, of course, a punishment. Fleeing is always a punishment. Dispersion is a punishment. Very different from the way the Lubavitcher Rebbe thinks about these concepts. There's nothing redemptive, I think, about exile, fleeing in the world of the Satmar Rebbe. It's something that a burden that we bear. For the Lubavitcher Rebbe, there is something redemptive there. So why is there something redemptive there for him? Before we get to really answer that question, I want to take a look at a couple of sources just to make us familiar with some major ideas in the Lubavitcher Rebbe's thinking. These are sort of foundational ideas, both for the Lubavitcher Rebbe in particular, but also in the Hasidic world in general. So one of them is this idea that you need to descend at times in order to make an ascent, in order to go up. That there are times where you have to go backwards in order to go forwards. So this idea is found, sometimes it appears in the Gemara, not always actually in a spiritual context, but at least in the Gemara in Hagiga, it does, and maybe one of the origins for this idea. So there's the Gemara in Hagiga is trying to understand what the actions of the angels are like in heaven. So when it says, and the divine creatures would run and they return, so they run out and they go back, like the appearance of a flash of lightning. And what is the meaning of ran and return? Rabbi Huda said it's like the fire that is emitted from a furnace, right? So if you have a flame, it goes out and then it seems to disappear and then it goes out again, sort of as the fire waxes and wanes. And that is what the angels are doing. So in order for the fire to climb higher, it has to return to the furnace, and then it can shoot upwards once again. And this idea really becomes foundational in the Hasidic world. So an early Hasidic source, the Degel Machane Ephraim, which was the Torah commentary of actually one of the grandsons of the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov was the founder of the Hasidic movement in many ways. So he develops this idea further certainly in a way in which the Lubavitcher Rebbe would have been familiar, and I think in a way in which the Lubavitcher Rebbe uses it as well. In his Torah commentary on Parshat Vayetze, which is in Sefer Breshit, and it has the story of Yaakov's ladder, where Yaakov comes to a place, he says, he decides to go to sleep there. He has a dream in which he sees a ladder standing over him with angels ascending and descending the ladder. And when he wakes up, he says, God was in this place and I did not know. So the Degel Machane Ephraim has a commentary on that story. And he writes, the secret of expansive knowledge and limited knowledge is found in the fact that the angels move constantly back and forth. They could not stay in the same place forever and needed to go up and down the ladder. Their descent enabled them to ascend. This process will bring one to a very lofty level and an expansive understanding, like it says, like Yaakov said, God was in this place, and this awareness is a lofty level, and I did not know. So in order sort of for Yaakov to to be like an angel, or in order for anyone to be like an angel, we also can't stay always in one place. That staying only in one place leads to a sort of limited knowledge. And that is why, and I think the Degel Machne Ephraim and Hasidic thinkers in general expanded this, not just to a physical place, obviously, but to a spiritual place. And even if we're in a good spiritual place, let's say, there are moments actually where we shouldn't choose to sin, but we should recognize that we will sin, we will make mistakes, we will fall off that lofty level that we're at, and that those descents, those sins, those failings allow us then to grow and ascend higher in the future. So that idea is really foundational to the way in which the Lubavitcher Rebbe is going to think about exile. Let me just unmute people and see if anyone wants to say anything. Okay, so you can unmute yourself for a moment if anyone has a question.
Rabbi, I would like only to remark that it's very particular about the Sumter Rebbe, that I agree that Torah really regards Galut as punishment, unlike the Lubavitcher Rebbe. It's absolute punishment. There's nothing redeeming in it in the Torah. But on the other hand, one must say that it was his policy of keeping the Jews in Europe that really brought the Holocaust to its full fruition, in quotation mark. Whereas if he would have let the people go to Israel, they would have lived, and at the same time he found his way very well out of the fairness into the United States. So I think there is a lot of hypocrisy in all this talk of his.
So
if I might say so.
The Sama Rebbe is a very complicated figure in a lot of ways, and I think you're right that he's managed to escape the Holocaust. He actually managed to escape. He was on I think it's called the Katzner train, which is a fascinating story in its own right about the train that the Zionist movement was sort of able to ransom from the Nazis, and became also then the subject of much scandal in later years in Israel. And you're right, the Satmar Rebbe and a whole number of Hasidic leaders who counseled their followers not to go to the land of Israel when they had the opportunity to do so, that there's no doubt that many people died because they heeded that advice. But sometime maybe we'll explore in more detail just the Satmar Rebbe's thought. But I definitely I think you're right that there's a lot that's problematic there. Okay, I'm going to go back and mute people, and we'll continue. Okay. So the next, there's one other foundational concept that's important that comes up again and again in the Lubavitcher Rebbe's thinking that we should look at sort of the primary sources for. And as far as I can tell, I think the best source of this in Chazal is this midrash that appears in Midrash Tanchuma, and it describes what God was hoping for when He created the world. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman said, when the Holy One, blessed be He, created the world, He longed to have an abode below, just as He had on high. Having created Adam, He commanded and said to him, you may eat freely of any tree in the garden, but as for the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you may not eat of it. Then Adam transgressed against His commandment, and the Holy One, blessed be He, said to him, this is what I had longed for, that just as I have a dwelling on high, I would likewise have one below. Now that when I've given you one command, you have not kept it. Immediately the Holy One, blessed be He, removed His divine presence up to the first firmament. So what this midrash is saying is one that God had a specific idea about what He wanted in the world. He wanted to have a dwelling place, what the Lubavitcher Rebbe will call a dira b'tachtonim, a dwelling place in the lower realms. He wanted the upper realms and the lower realms to be similar in sort of the manifestation of God's presence, which we probably could think of lots of ways of describing and thinking about. And that when people sin, when Adam Harishon sinned in Gan Eden by eating from the tree, God pulled back his presence in some way. And this midrash continues at length, sort of highlighting those moments in Jewish history when God deepens his presence in the world, when people do mitzvot and act correctly, and then those moments in history when God pulls back and recedes from the world as a response to sin. So there's this one, you have that constant back and forth again that we sort of saw before, but this idea that what God really wants is a dwelling place in the lower world, in our world, and the way in which we create that space for him is by doing mitzvot, is very important in the thought of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And it's important for him from the very beginning of his time leading his Hasidim. So in 1951, he gives an address which is called Basel Agane. Those were the opening words of the mimer, the address he gave. And this is sort of seen as his inaugural address, the moment when he really became Rebbe. So let's just see how he talks about the concept there. The matter, i.e. the explanation as to why the essence of the Shekhinah was specifically found in this world, is as follows. The Shekhinah is, of course, the divine presence. The ultimate purpose for the creation and progressive descent of the worlds is that God desired to have a dwelling place in the lower worlds. It is thus understandable that the intent of creation is not the higher worlds whose purpose is revelation, but this lowly world that imagines itself to be not a mere revelation, but a self-sufficient entity whose being derives from its own self. Through man's spiritual service in this world, subduing and transforming the physical into holiness, God's essence is revealed in this world, in the world for the sake of which the worlds at large were created, and for the sake of which they progressively descended. So the focus for the Lubavitcher Rebbe of Judaism is not on correcting some failing on high, or as it is for some Kabbalists who really focus on uniting the higher worlds or correcting the higher worlds, nor is it just about pure service of God, purely doing the mitzvot, because that's what God commanded us to do, as it is for some more rationalist thinkers. There's a purpose to the mitzvot, and that purpose is to affect and impact our world. And ultimately, that effect and impact is felt because it will reveal God's presence in our world. And the uplifting of our world is the focus of Judaism. So it's very much focused on where we are, and not simply doing the mitzvot without reason or without purpose, and also not doing them with the aim of sort of correcting something on high. It's about where we are right now. So with that background, with the idea that now that we understand this principle that he's going to talk about, that there are times where we fail or fall or descend, but that is in order to allow us to achieve greater heights, as well as the fact that there are moments where as well as the fact that the purpose of doing mitzvot and the purpose for which the world was created, God says, is to create a dwelling place for him in the lowest of worlds, our world. That let's look at some sources specifically from the Lubavitcher Rebbe about exile and about Tisha B'Av. Now, most of these talks that I've sort of excerpted from here were given on Shabbos Chazon. As far as I know, I haven't seen talks, and I don't know the whole corpus of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's literature backwards and forwards, but I haven't seen talks that he gave on Tisha B'Av. So I'm not sure how much teaching actually was done on Tisha B'Av. I do know that he would speak about Tisha B'Av, the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av, and oftentimes he talks about themes related to Tisha B'Av, certainly throughout the whole month of Tammuz. Okay, so in 1987 in a talk, he said, "It is known that the purpose of the descent into exile is for the subsequent ascent. For our divine service during the period of exile will bring about an even greater degree of revelation in the era of redemption than there was during the time of the Beit HaMikdash. the sequence parallels the interpretation of the verse, the advantage of light over darkness. That darkness evokes a greater measure of light, bringing out a higher level of light than was previously revealed. Moreover, through the Jews' observance of Torah and its mitzvot during the time of exile, they ascend to a higher spiritual level, attaining an even higher rung than during the time of the Beit HaMikdash. There are two dimensions of this. The service in the time of exile reveals the intensity and the infinite dimension of the spiritual light, that even the greatest darkness possible, and in particular, doubled and redoubled darkness in the era of Ikvisa de Mashiach, the time when the Mashiach's approaching footsteps can be heard, cannot bring about the concealment for it. When speaking in general terms, this alludes to the light that is above the Kalim, the light that is apart. This light can be described as infinite, but it is nevertheless categorized as light. And secondly, the transformation of darkness into light reveals God's essence, which transcends the categories of light and darkness. Okay, so there's some Kabbalistic terminology here, like about the Kalim, that I don't want to get into because it will take us far afield. But I do want to highlight a couple things here. One is, again, that the descent, right, is for an ascent, for that we go into exile so that we can achieve a loftier spiritual level. And why does he think this is the case? He thinks this is the case because that somehow the greater the obstacles you face, the greater the darkness you face, when you do mitzvot under those trying circumstances, you bring out a much greater level of holiness and light into the world. That the greater your challenge, the greater, let's say, your victory, or the greater you're uplifted when you meet that challenge. And that is why the greater the intensity, the more burdensome, the more oppressive, the worse the exile, the more light and holiness is released into the world when Jews do mitzvot and keep the Torah, even in those trying circumstances. And secondly, also, he says that this whole idea of darkness doesn't really exist because it can be turned, it can be transformed into light. We talked 2 days ago about how the Rebbe Soloveitchik really felt that it was important to recognize that evil exists in the world, right? And not to diminish suffering as being purely something that's meant to make us grow, or not to try to explain suffering as a tool that God uses to make us grow in very specific ways. So for the Lubavitcher Rebbe, though suffering is an exile and evil are conceived of differently, that evil for him is really the absence of good, just as darkness, he would say, is the absence of light. And that if you bring good and light into a place of darkness and exile, or darkness and evil, that whole darkness isn't pushed away, it doesn't go somewhere else. It's completely transformed, and it too becomes light. It too becomes holiness, and that can happen, he says, only in exile, only after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, so let's keep going, and we'll take a look at another talk he gave. This is slightly longer, but I think summarizes many of his key ideas, key thoughts quite well. Okay, so this talk began, oftentimes his talks, as many Hasidic talks do traditionally, would begin by quoting a pasuk, a verse. And here he quotes the first verse in Eicha. How does the city sit solitary? She that was filled with a multitude of people. The Tzemach Tzedek interprets this verse with a positive connotation. The Tzemach Tzedek was the third Lubavitcher Rebbe. And one of the things the Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson would do, and all of the later Lubavitcher Rebbe's would do, is that they would oftentimes quote their predecessors. And they wouldn't just give talks based on their own ideas, but they would really give their talks as a sort of gloss and explanation and commentary on talks given by their predecessors. So the Tzemach Tzedek interprets this verse with a positive connotation, which is really surprising because this verse on a pshat level, on a simple level, is not meant in a positive way. When we read this verse last night, and David read it with its beautiful mournful tune, there's nothing positive about hearing this. But he read it in a positive way, explaining that Jerusalem sitting solitary reflects an elevated spiritual side, as it's written that God let them alone, and as it's written that securely and alone, as in Yaakov's blessing. This exalted state will come about as a result of being filled with people, as we'll explain. This sublime level, which will be realized in the era of redemption, will come about as a result of sitting solitary in the time of exile. In this context, we find that our sages compare the exile of the Jewish people to Adam's being sentenced to exile after the sin of eating from the tree of knowledge. So something about sitting alone in exile, being solitary in exile, will then allow us to be a gathering, to be connected and to be filled with a multitude of people at the time of redemption. If we are solitary and focused on our commitment to Torah, when we are in exile, then we will have a multitude of people when redemption comes. And I think that Tzemach Tzedek is reading, understanding the pasuk's reference to a city here, not in terms of the physical location of Jerusalem, but actually maybe in a more expansive way. He's thinking about the whole Jewish people, that we are lonely in exile, but if that loneliness is not necessarily a curse, that can also be to our praise that we are lonely because we don't assimilate, we don't disappear, we stay committed to the Torah and to mitzvot, and because of that, because of our stubborn loneliness in that way, that is actually a praise of us. And later in the talk, the Lubavitcher Rebbe continues about how history, he would say, I think, is sort of predetermined in a certain way with these ascents and descents, and then ascents again. After the giving of the Torah, the Jews intended to enter Eretz Israel and build the Beit HaMikdash. The Beit HaMikdash is described as the place which God chose and reflects a higher spiritual level than the sanctuary of which it is said, I sojourned in a tent. The Beit HaMikdash is a step up from the Mishkan that the Jewish people had while they were in the Midbar, while they were in the desert. But there were several disruptions before the building of the Beit HaMikdash. And the spiritual peaks attained at the construction of the Beit HaMikdash were followed by a descent, the destruction. This in turn was followed by an ascent, the building of the second Beit HaMikdash, which in certain dimensions surpassed the first Beit HaMikdash. For our sages interpret the verse, the glory of this later house will be greater than that of the first, as referring to the second Beit HaMikdash, which surpassed the first in size and in the number of years which it stood. So the second Beit HaMikdash, there are all sorts of ways in which Chazal tell us actually that the second Beit HaMikdash was inferior to the first Beit HaMikdash, but there are also some ways in which they tell us it was greater than, certainly in size, and it definitely stood for many more years. Similarly, the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash is intended to enable us to reach an even higher level, the third Beit HaMikdash, which will be built in the near future by Mashiach, and which will represent a higher spiritual plateau than both the first and the second Beit HaMikdash. This is reflected in the statement of our sages quoted above, that the site will not be called a mountain as it was referred to by Abraham, the site of Har HaMoriah, where the Beit of Har HaBayit, the site will not be called a mountain as referred to by Abraham, nor a field as referred to by Yitzhak, but rather a house as referred to by Yaakov, which is obviously a house seems to be more developed than a mountain or a field. Thus, through our deeds and service in the present era, we bring about the building and revelation of the third Beit HaMikdash in the immediate future, and the attainment of this level alluded to securely and alone as in Yaakov's blessing. This structure will fuse together the advantages of the first Beit HaMikdash and the second Beit HaMikdash. So for the Lubavitcher Rebbe here, the destruction of the first, the inability of the Jewish people to enter the land of Israel because of the sin of the spies, as well as the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash and the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, these are all temporary and necessary setbacks that allow us always for future growth. So here we have the sort of rhythms of history, that descending for the sake of ascending, those up and downs, which are that idea that we said was so critical in Hasidic thought, we see play out here in the way he thinks about the unfolding of history. And there is actually, for the Lubavitcher Rebbe, something that is, he's a bit of a determinist in the way he sees history. That this arc of history of the ups and downs, I don't think he's a determinist on an individual level. We have free will, but the broad strokes of history seem to be predetermined in many ways here. That even though the Gemara tells us that the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed because of 3 sins that the Jewish people committed, and the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed because of sinat chinam, because of senseless hatred, right? There seems to be a direct cause and effect. Something bad happened, then the Jewish people are punished. For the Lubavitcher Rebbe, these destructions were built into history from the very beginning. And he spells this out in a sikha, in a shorter talk that he gave in 1981, where he asked a question about the Rambam. That the Rambam in Hilchot Beit HaBehira, the fourth parak of Hilchot Beit HaBehira, where he talks about the laws of the Beit HaMikdash, the Rambam explains that Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, when he was building the Beit HaMikdash, the Rambam writes that he knew in the end it would be destroyed. And because of that, he built a place for the Aron, for the Ark to be concealed. And that the Ark actually, according to the Rambam, was never removed from Har Habayit. It was never removed from the environs of where the temple stood, because it had been buried at some point in the first temple period. And this also explains why the second temple was not missing anything from the first temple, since the Ark was also in place. But it was in its hidden compartment, which had been built for it. And it will now be further understood that 3 temples are not 3 separate buildings, but are essentially one house rebuilt. Already in the building of the first temple, things were determined concerning the second and the third, and part of it, the place of the Ark hidden in the depths of the earth, is eternal and exists forever. So the third Beit HaMikdash and the second Beit HaMikdash were not new buildings. They were really continuations of that first building, and that they already, from the first Beit HaMikdash, it was built with the idea that destruction would happen and then future growth would happen as well. And that was all set in sort of baked into the fabric of the world, of the fabric of the cosmos, and into the architecture of the Beit HaMikdash from the very beginning. I think also that there's a powerful idea when if we think about this, not just with the Beit HaMikdash, but also with individuals. That individuals, of course, experience ups and downs throughout their life. We all experience ups and downs, setbacks and successes, and that is the natural arc of life, and that we have to look at those setbacks as opportunities for future growth. And from even if in the moment it's important for us to know that we have free will, when we take a step back and look back on our past months or years later, I think it can be very helpful sometimes to believe that it was all that God had a preordained path for us, and that some of those setbacks and successes and then failures again before future growth were laid out before us from the very beginning, even if we didn't know them. And that is certainly how the Lubavitcher Rebbe thought about the building, destruction, and rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash. I'm going to close just with one more source, and then we'll open it up to some discussion and questions. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe said that when we look at a tragedy, now only we must look at the good outcome, and that will result from this destruction. But more so, the loftier attainment of redemption should not be seen merely as something achieved through a secondary, not good event. Rather, the destruction and redemption, are a single phenomenon. So for the Lubavitcher Rebbe, exile, tragedy, destruction is completely bound up with redemption, and growth, and that those two things really happen in one moment. That in the moment of loss, the moment of exile, the moment of tragedy, that also is in that same moment, that is the push for future growth and for redemption. And those two things, tragedy and redemption, exile and redemption, can never be separated. And that's why exile cannot be seen as just as a catastrophe, because it contains within it the essence of our future redemption. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute people now and see if anyone has any questions.